our bodies have an amazing ability to maintain their internal conditions and not let things fluctuate too much. So the word for this is homeostasis. Homeostasis is referring to the steady state, the fact that our bodies can maintain a steady state internally. And they can do this even when your surroundings change, right? Even if the weather changes, if the temperature fluctuates in the room that you're in, even so, your internal body environment is kept pretty constant, which is amazing. It's amazing the detection abilities that our bodies have and the way that they can respond to things like this. So when homeostasis is not maintained, when those internal conditions are not kept pretty constant, that can actually be an indication of disease, and that's something that doctors watch out for, is whether there are changes to homeostasis or not. One example of a disease that is regarding homeostasis would be diabetes. So ordinarily in our bodies, the blood glucose levels, the amount of sugar that's dissolved in the blood, ordinarily it's kept at a pretty constant value, and the way that is done is so our cells can take in glucose from the blood, right? So if we eat a sugary meal, something with sugar in it, what would happen is our cells would start to absorb more glucose from the blood, and that would help to keep the blood glucose levels pretty constant. Well, in the case of diabetes, that doesn't happen, and so the blood glucose levels fluctuate. The blood glucose levels might get really high, so high that glucose might start being excreted in the urine, which is not normal. So diabetes is essentially it's a loss of glucose homeostasis. So homeostasis is not being maintained in that case. I would like to describe two other examples of homeostasis mechanisms. And we're going to start with the mechanism that allows us to control temperature of our bodies. So your body is kept at a pretty constant internal temperature. It doesn't matter if it's summer or if it's winter. Your body temperature stays about the same. And this is called thermoregulation. So this is referring to temperature regulation inside of the body. So thermoregulation. Okay, we're going to start with just sort of normal body temperature. Normal body temperature for humans is around 98.6, might be a little bit lower, varies a little bit from person to person. But in any case, each person has kind of like one specific set point, and we're going to start at that set point and consider what happens. So what happens if this person goes outside on a hot day and they do some work and maybe their body temperature starts to increase. Maybe their body temperature moves above this set point. So what's going to happen then? If our bodies get too hot, what will happen is the brain actually can detect that. The brain has has kind of like sensors built into it in the hypothalamus of the brain. And what happens is if the body does get too hot, so if the hypothalamus detects that we're above the set point, then what it does is it causes our blood vessels to dilate near the surface. We talked about that a little bit already. And so the brain will send a signal to the muscles lining the blood vessels, cause them to dilate, and that'll bring the blood closer to the surface of the body, which allows heat to escape. And then the other key thing that takes place is we start sweating. So our sweat glands are stimulated to produce sweat. And what does that do? That helps us cool down, right? Because it provides it's a wet surface, and that when evaporation happens, that evaporation will carry away some of the heat with it. So it helps to cool us down. So in the end, these responses, these two things that take place, they help to bring our bodies back down to the set point. So we've just corrected for that deviation. This is maintaining homeostasis. We can think about it in the other direction too. What happens if our bodies start to get too cold? If our set point, if our body temperatures drop below the set point, then what will we do? Well, kind of just the opposite. The blood vessels will constrict, and that's going to happen so that the heat is brought away from the surface, more towards the center of the body, like where your heart is at. Helps to keep that heat very internal. And we'll also start shivering if we're really cold. So shivering, what is that doing? That's just activating a whole bunch of muscles throughout your body, when muscles are activated, they generate heat. When they burn energy, they create some heat. So this is actually helping to generate heat and warm us back up. A third thing, this one's a little bit less intuitive. The metabolic rate increases. Whoops, typo right there. Increases. Metabolic rates, so this is essentially the rate at which our cells are using energy. So if they're using energy at a faster pace, they're going to be releasing a little bit more heat as a consequence of that. So all three of these things would help to bring our body temperature back up to the set point. So we've got control mechanisms in place for either way. If we get too hot or if we get too cold, either way, our bodies can maintain homeostasis by making these modifications, these responses. The exception to this would be if we are sick, if we have a fever, then that's kind of an intentional thing our bodies do. So what happens with a fever is, it's actually amazing, it's quite complex. So if you have some type of an infection, like with a bacteria or with some viruses that can trigger this as well, what can take place is our immune cells, when they detect the presence of that bacteria or virus, our immune cells start producing a chemical. It's called a pyrogen, and it circulates through the blood. When it makes it to the brain, when it makes it to the hypothalamus, it will bind to this regulatory center in the brain, the hypothalamus, and it causes the brain to increase the set point for a time. So then the body warms up, and that's called having a fever, and that will last for a little bit of time. It may even last up for a couple of days, and this does actually a number of really important things. So for one thing, it slows down the rate at which bacteria can grow and reproduce, so it slows down the spread of the infection in our bodies. Same thing for viruses, it slows down the rate at which viruses can reproduce. And that's sort of, in some ways, that's sort of buying time. That allows our immune systems some time to ramp up production of antibodies and respond to the infection and deal with it. Let's see, what else does a fever do? A fever also helps to activate certain cells of our immune system. It makes them work at a faster pace. So fever is something that we don't want it to get out of control. It shouldn't go much higher than like 104. That's when it can start to be dangerous because why? You can probably think this through and figure out the reason why. What happens if proteins get heated up? If you heat up a protein, eventually it's going to unfold. And we said proteins are really dependent on their 3D structure. So if you heat a protein too high, to too high of a temperature, it will denature, it will unfold, and that can be irreversible. So that's why fevers that go above 104 can be very serious. This is why you don't want to let a fever go above 104 degrees. However, if it is a low-grade fever, like 101, even 102 is okay, that can actually be very helpful for allowing our bodies to fight off an infection. So there are some mixed opinions about whether to take fever-reducing medications or not when you're sick. A number of doctors actually say if it's a low fever, like 101, 102, just let it run its course. If you're very uncomfortable, then you might want to take something to reduce your fever, because that probably means you're not resting well. So it's kind of this tricky balance. Rest is very important when you're sick, but also the fever is sort of helping our immune system fight off the infection. So it's a balance. The other example of homeostasis that we're going to mention here is osmoregulation. Osmoregulation refers to controlling the amount of dissolved salts and other substances that exist in the blood. So we want to keep those levels pretty constant. And the kidneys are really key in doing this job. The urinary system is responsible for providing osmoregulation. The urinary system is the system that filters all of the blood, and it pulls out a lot of the wastes, and those wastes are excreted in the urine, and the body gets rid of them that way. So the interesting thing about this, though, is that the kidneys have to be very discriminatory. They have to be very good at separating waste products from valuable substances. We don't want to be flushing out important things like amino acids or glucose. We don't want to lose those in the urine. So the kidneys have to have a way of holding those things back while also getting rid of the waste. And it's amazing how they do this. The kidneys, I am going to show you some details of how they do this, just because it's kind of interesting how they do this. In the end, what I'd like you to know as the takeaway is that in the end, the kidneys do concentrate the waste products. Those leave in the urine. And the kidneys also recollect water and valuable things like glucose, and they return those back to the blood. So kidneys do both these things: hold back valuable things, get rid of the wastes. So some details, this is FYI, this is not something I will test you on, but this is something that I thought you might be interested to hear about. So how do the kidneys do this amazing job? Kidneys, if we take a cross section through a kidney, what we would see is they have these sort of triangle shapes. These are actually called the pyramids inside of the kidney. And if we zoom in on a pyramid, what we would see are these little structures. These are called nephrons, these sort of curly things. And each of these is a site where blood gets filtered. So nephrons, we'll take a look at this on the next couple of slides. Nephrons are really the key structures inside of the kidneys that do the filtering. So the blood flow into the kidneys. Blood flows into the kidney through the renal artery. Let me switch to this next picture. Into the kidney through the renal artery, and then it branches out into lots of different pathways. Look at follow the red color, that's representing the artery. So blood comes in through this artery, branches out all over the place, makes its way out to a nephron, and this nephron is going to switch to this picture. Okay, blood flows into the nephron right here. And right here, this is called the glomerulus. The glomerulus allows water to pass through, but it does not allow blood cells to pass through. Okay, so the blood cells continue on down this pathway. Blood cells and large molecules pass along, continue on down the artery. Meanwhile, the water and a lot of the things dissolved in the water, they travel through this tubule. While they travel through this tubule, what the tubule does is it transports water and salt back out. Actually, it transports the salt out, and then water follows it by osmosis. So transports it out, and then what do you notice? This artery, the capillary, it branches out and it sort of innervates this whole region. The blood vessels actually reabsorb the water right here locally. Again, this is a lot of detail, and I'm not going to be testing you on this. This is how kidneys work, and I think it's fascinating. So anyway, blood cells are traveling through here. The water rejoins the blood cells, but the wastes are kept back. The waste stays in the tubule. So the waste products continue on down here, follow it around, leaves through this collecting duct. And let me go back to this picture. Okay, the collecting ducts lead to the renal pelvis, which is this section here. The renal pelvis sends the urine down the ureter, and that goes to the urinary bladder.